The camera was already rolling when James walked into that restaurant. Victor and Robert sat in the corner booth, phones positioned perfectly, hearts pounding with anticipation. They'd been waiting for this moment, the moment their perfect little brother would finally be exposed. You see, James Lawson had just inherited the majority share of their father's company, not because he was the oldest, not because he was the smartest, but because their father believed James was the kindest, the most genuine, the one who truly cared about people. His brothers thought it was all an act. They'd set him up on a blind date with Mitchell, a young woman they deliberately didn't tell him was autistic. They thought this would be the test that would shatter James's good guy image. The plan was simple. Record everything, catch James being uncomfortable or cruel, and use it to challenge their father's decision. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would destroy them emotionally, just not in the way they expected. Before we continue, I'm on a mission to hit 1,000 subscribers before the New Year Festival, and I really need your help to get there. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that subscribe button. It would mean the absolute world to me. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from you all. James sat down at the table, completely unaware he was being watched. He looked nervous, but not the guilty kind of nervous. This was a man genuinely trying to start over after 4 years of being alone. His 8-year-old daughter Lisa had been pushing him to date again, telling him that her mom would want him to be happy. When Mitchell walked in, Victor and Robert leaned forward. This was it. She moved carefully, methodically scanning the room. She didn't make eye contact with the hostess and spoke in a flat, precise tone. Everything about her was different, and the brothers were sure James would notice immediately and find some excuse to leave. But James stood up when she approached. He introduced himself calmly and shook her hand when she offered it. When Mitchell sat down and adjusted her chair twice to get the perfect angle, James didn't react with confusion or impatience. He just waited. Then Mitchell told him directly that she was autistic, explaining that most people found that uncomfortable. The brothers held their breath. This was the moment James would crack. But he didn't. James simply thanked her for telling him and said he wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions unless she wanted to share. No shock, no awkwardness, just acceptance. Mitchell seemed surprised by this, maybe even relieved. As they started talking, James noticed how Mitchell communicated and adjusted to match her pace. He gave her space, didn't interrupt, and when she mentioned her love for complex technical puzzles, he genuinely engaged with the topic. His daughter Lisa also loved puzzles, and that became their connection point. Victor and Robert watched in growing disbelief. This wasn't going according to plan at all. James wasn't performing or pretending. He was actually connecting with Mitchell, treating her like a person he wanted to know, not a problem to solve or avoid. The date continued, and James kept showing patience his brothers had convinced themselves was fake. He let Mitchell order her food exactly how she needed it, without comment. He talked about his late wife honestly when Mitchell asked, explaining how Lisa had helped him learn patience in ways he never expected. What Victor and Robert didn't know was that raising Lisa alone had taught James something profound. Lisa had her own quirks, her own way of processing the world. She needed routines, clear communication, and space when things got overwhelming. James had learned to read those signs, to adapt, to meet people where they were. Mitchell wasn't that different from his daughter in some ways, and James recognized that immediately. By the time their food arrived, Mitchell had relaxed completely. She was talking about her freelance work, her interest in mechanical systems, and James was genuinely fascinated. He asked questions that showed he was actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to talk. The brothers sat in their booth, phones still recording, but their confidence was crumbling. This wasn't the gotcha moment they'd planned for. This was something else entirely. The date lasted 2 hours, and Victor and Robert watched every minute of it. James never once checked his phone. He never looked uncomfortable. He never made Mitchell feel like she was a burden or an inconvenience. Instead, he treated her with the kind of genuine respect that made his brothers physically uncomfortable to witness. About an hour in, Mitchell mentioned how dating was usually terrible for her. People would either fetishize her autism, treating her like some kind of puzzle to solve, or they'd be openly condescending, talking to her like she was a child. Some dates had ended within minutes, once guys realized she was autistic. James listened to all of this and then shared his own experience. After his wife died, he'd tried dating once about a year ago. The woman had been nice enough, but the moment she met Lisa and saw how specific Lisa could be about routines and preferences, she'd made a comment about dealing with difficult children. James had ended that date immediately. That's when Mitchell looked directly at him for the first time that evening and said something that hit different. She told him that Lisa was lucky to have a father who protected her space instead of apologizing for it. Victor felt something twist in his chest watching that moment. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The conversation moved to lighter topics after that. Mitchell explained her work as a technical writer, how she documented complex systems and made them understandable. James talked about the company he now ran, how his father had built it on the principle that good business meant treating people well, not just maximizing profit. That's when Mitchell asked a question that changed everything. She asked James why he thought his father had chosen him to run the company over his older brothers. James was quiet for a moment, then he said something honest. He explained that he didn't think he was smarter or more capable than Victor and Robert, but their father had watched how James treated people when he thought no one important was watching, how he spoke to the janitors, how he remembered the names of security guards' kids, how he'd restructured one department to accommodate a single mother's school pickup schedule. His father had once told him that anyone could be kind when it benefited them, but real character showed up when kindness was inconvenient. Mitchell nodded slowly at that, processing it. Then she said something that made James laugh. She told him that inconvenient kindness was basically her entire dating experience in reverse. She was the inconvenient part, and most people's kindness evaporated pretty quickly. James didn't laugh at that part. He looked at her seriously and said that wasn't kindness then, that was performance. Real kindness didn't have conditions. In their corner booth, Robert set his phone down. He couldn't watch anymore. Victor kept recording, but his hand was shaking slightly. The date was supposed to prove James was fake. Instead, it was proving something neither brother wanted to face, that James was exactly who he appeared to be, and they were the ones who'd been performing their entire lives. When dessert came, Mitchell did something unexpected. She asked James if he knew about the camera. She'd noticed his brothers in the corner booth about halfway through the date. She worked with patterns and systems for a living. Two men intensely focused on one table for 2 hours straight wasn't normal restaurant behavior. James turned around and saw them. The color drained from his face. Mitchell told him she'd assumed they were friends playing a prank, but watching James's reaction, she realized it was worse than that. James looked back at her, and for the first time that evening, he looked genuinely upset, not at her, at the situation. He apologized immediately. He said he had no idea they were there, that he'd thought this was just a normal blind date set up by a mutual friend. Then he asked if she wanted to leave, said he'd understand completely if this whole thing felt like a violation. But Mitchell didn't leave. She asked him one question. Was anything he'd said or done that evening fake? James said no. Everything was real. Meeting her was real. The conversation was real. His interest in seeing her again was real. Mitchell considered this for a long moment, then told him she believed him. She said she'd gotten pretty good at spotting when people were lying or performing, and James hadn't done either of those things all evening. Then she did something that broke Victor completely. She suggested they finish dessert and ignore the cameras, because she was actually having a good time and didn't want his brother's cruelty to ruin it. James agreed, but he told Mitchell he needed to address this afterward. This wasn't okay, and his brothers needed to know that. They finished their dessert, and James walked Mitchell to her car. Victor and Robert couldn't hear what they said, but they saw Mitchell smile, an actual, genuine smile, before she got in her car and drove away. Then James turned around and walked straight toward his brother's table. James didn't yell. That's what made it worse. He sat down across from Victor and Robert, and the disappointment on his face was devastating. He asked them quietly what they thought they were doing, but he already knew the answer. They wanted to prove he was fake. They wanted evidence to challenge the will. Victor tried to defend it at first, saying they had a right to know if James was manipulating everyone. But Robert stayed silent, staring at his phone like he wanted to disappear. James let Victor talk himself out. Then he said something that cut deep. He told them he'd never asked for the company. He never asked Dad to choose him. He'd actually tried to convince their father to split everything equally because he knew this would happen, knew his brothers would resent him for it. But their father had refused. He'd told James that Victor and Robert were capable businessmen, but they led with ego instead of empathy. They treated employees like resources instead of people. And in their father's eyes, that wasn't the legacy he wanted to leave. James told his brothers he'd spent the last 6 months trying to bridge the gap between them, trying to involve them in decisions, try to show them he valued their input, but they'd responded with coldness and suspicion at every turn. And tonight was the final proof that they'd rather destroy him than work with him. Then James said something that made Victor finally break. He told them that what they'd done to Mitchell was unforgivable. She wasn't part of their family drama. She was a real person who'd been used as a prop in their cruel little experiment. And if they had any decency at all, they'd apologize to her directly. Robert finally spoke up. His voice was barely a whisper. He said he was sorry, that watching the date had made him realize how wrong they'd been. Not just about James, but about everything. Victor couldn't speak. He just sat there with tears running down his face, still holding his phone with the recording that was supposed to vindicate them, but instead showed them exactly who they'd become. James stood up to leave, but before he did, he told them something important. He said their father didn't choose him because he was perfect or because he was manipulating anyone. Their father chose him because when James didn't know what to do, he defaulted to kindness instead of self-protection. And maybe if Victor and Robert learned to do the same, they could actually be the brothers he needed instead of the enemies they decided to be. Then he left. Victor and Robert sat in that booth for another hour, not talking, just thinking about what they'd witnessed. They'd set up an elaborate trap to prove their brother was a fraud, and instead, they'd captured evidence of their own cruelty and jealousy. The next morning, Victor and Robert did something they should have done months ago. They went to the family estate lawyer and confessed everything. They explained the setup, the recording, the malicious intent behind it all. They said they wanted to formally apologize to James and accept whatever consequences came from their actions. The lawyer was stunned but appreciated their honesty. He scheduled a meeting for all three brothers later that week. But before that meeting, Robert did something on his own. He tracked down Mitchell's contact information and sent her a message. He apologized for using her as a pawn in their family drama. He told her that watching her date with James had shown him what genuine human decency looked like, and he was ashamed of his part in trying to exploit it. Mitchell responded the next day. She told Robert that apologies only meant something if they led to changed behavior, but she appreciated him reaching out. She also mentioned that she and James had a second date planned for that weekend, and if Robert was serious about changing, he should start by respecting his brother's happiness instead of resenting it. Robert read that message 5 times. Then he showed it to Victor, the meeting with the lawyer, and James happened 3 days after the disastrous date. Victor and Robert walked in expecting anger, maybe even legal action. Instead, James just looked tired. They apologized formally. They explained their resentment, their jealousy, their mistaken belief that James had manipulated their father. They admitted that the date had forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. James wasn't the problem. They were. James listened to everything. Then he sighed. He told them he forgave them. But forgiveness didn't mean everything was fine. Trust took time to rebuild, and they'd shattered as completely. He said he still wanted them involved in the company because they were talented and capable, but things would be different now. Clear boundaries, professional distance, and absolutely zero tolerance for treating people as disposable. Victor and Robert agreed to everything. They signed documents formally accepting James's role as CEO and promising to end any challenges to the will. It wasn't a happy reconciliation, but it was a start. As they left the lawyer's office, Victor stopped James and asked him one question. How did he do it? How did he stay kind when life had given him every reason to be bitter? James thought about it for a moment, then gave an honest answer. He said that after his wife died, he'd had a choice. He could let the grief make him hard and close off, or he could let it make him more aware of other people's pain. Lisa had needed him to choose the second option, so he did, and eventually it stopped being a choice and just became who he was. Victor nodded slowly, understanding for the first time what their father had seen in James that they'd been too proud to recognize. 3 months later, James officially took over as CEO of the company. His first major decision surprised everyone. He created a company-wide inclusion program, specifically designed to hire and support neurodivergent employees. He brought Mitchell in as a consultant to help design workplace accommodations that actually worked instead of just checking boxes for HR compliance. Victor and Robert supported the initiative fully. They'd spent the last 3 months doing the work to repair their relationship with James, and part of that meant learning to see the world the way he did, as a place where everyone deserved dignity and opportunity. But the bigger change happened in James's personal life. That second date with Mitchell had gone even better than the first. Then there was a third date and a fourth. By the end of the first month, they were seeing each other twice a week. Mitchell had been nervous about meeting Lisa, worried that an 8-year-old wouldn't understand or might see her as weird. James had prepared Lisa carefully. He'd explained that Mitchell's brain worked differently than most people's, that she might need things a certain way or might not always make eye contact, and that none of that meant anything was wrong. It just meant she processed the world differently. Lisa had listened carefully, then asked if Mitchell liked puzzles. When James said yes, Lisa had grinned and said she already liked her. The first meeting happened at James's house on a Saturday afternoon. Mitchell arrived exactly on time, carrying a 1,000-piece puzzle she thought Lisa might enjoy. Lisa opened the door, looked at Mitchell seriously, and said she had 3 rules. No loud noises in the house, no touching her stuff without asking, and no lying about whether you like something just to be nice. Mitchell had smiled for real and told Lisa those were excellent rules, and she followed the exact same ones. They'd spent 3 hours working on that puzzle together, while James made lunch. At one point, he walked into the living room to find them both completely absorbed in sorting edge pieces, neither one talking, just existing comfortably in the same space. Lisa had looked up at him and given a thumbs up. That was her signal that everything was good. Over the next few months, Mitchell became a regular part of their lives. She and Lisa bonded over their shared love of patterns and systems. Mitchell taught Lisa about circuit diagrams and mechanical systems. Lisa taught Mitchell about her collection of rocks and minerals that she'd organized by geological classification. James watched his daughter come alive in a way she hadn't since her mother died. Lisa had always been a bit different from other kids. More serious, more focused, more particular about how things should be. Other adults had sometimes made her feel like that was a problem, but Mitchell never did. Mitchell understood exactly how Lisa's mind worked because her own worked similarly. One evening, after Mitchell had gone home, Lisa crawled into James's lap and told him something important. She said Mitchell made her feel like being different was okay, that she didn't have to pretend to be like everyone else. James hugged his daughter tight and told her that being different was more than okay. It was perfect. And Mitchell had shown him that too. 6 months into their relationship, Mitchell made a big decision. She'd always worked from home as a freelancer, but she decided to take on a more visible role as the lead consultant for James's company inclusion program. It meant going into an office, attending meetings, interacting with people more than she was used to. It was scary, but she told James she was tired of hiding, tired of making herself smaller to make other people comfortable. She wanted to be visible, to show other autistic people that they could build careers and relationships and full lives without masking who they were. James was incredibly proud of her. The company program became a massive success. Within 6 months, they'd hired 15 neurodivergent employees across various departments, and productivity had actually increased because people were finally working in environments designed for how their brains actually function instead of forcing everyone into the same mold. Other companies started reaching out, asking how they'd done it. Mitchell started getting speaking invitations. The business press wrote articles about the radical inclusion model that was somehow also incredibly profitable. Victor and Robert admitted privately that they never would have thought of this. Their approach had always been to find the best people, which really meant people who fit a very narrow definition of normal. James had expanded that definition and discovered a whole pool of talented people everyone else had been ignoring. 1 year after that first date, James took Mitchell and Lisa back to the same restaurant. Mitchell had known something was up because James had been unusually nervous all week. Lisa kept giggling randomly and refusing to explain why. They sat at the same table where they'd had their first date. The Christmas decorations were up again, the same golden bells and soft lights. James ordered the same water he'd ordered a year ago. Then, after dinner, Lisa looked at Mitchell with the most serious expression an 8-year-old could manage and said she had a question. She asked Mitchell if she would be part of their family, like officially forever. Mitchell's eyes went wide, and she looked at James, who was already kneeling beside the table with a ring box in his hand. James told Mitchell that she'd shown him something he'd forgotten how to believe in after his wife died. That second chances of happiness were real. That love could look different than he'd expected and still be perfect. That family could be built on understanding instead of just obligation. He asked her to marry him. Mitchell started crying, which was rare for her. She told James yes, that she'd been part of their family since that first date anyway. And this just made it official. Lisa cheered and hugged Mitchell tight, already planning how the wedding would be organized by a geological theme, naturally, since they'd bonded over rocks. They sat there in that restaurant, The three of them, laughing and crying and planning a future that a year ago had seemed impossible. Across town, Victor and Robert were having dinner with the estate lawyer, finally signing the last of the documents that formally ended all challenges to their father's will. As they left the restaurant, Victor said something to Robert that he'd been thinking about for months. He said their father had been right. About James. About leadership. About what actually mattered. Robert agreed. Then he said something else. That maybe the cruelest gift they'd ever received was that hidden camera footage, because it forced them to see exactly who they'd become and decide if they wanted to keep being those people. They'd chosen not to. It had taken a year of hard work, therapy, honest conversations, and letting go of ego, but they'd chosen differently. They still weren't as close to James as they'd been as kids, but they were building something better: respect, honesty, and genuine support instead of resentment and competition. Back at the restaurant, James, Mitchell, and Lisa were getting ready to leave. As they walked out into the cold December evening, Lisa held Mitchell's hand on one side and James's hand on the other. Mitchell looked at James over Lisa's head and smiled. Not the careful, controlled smile she used in professional settings, but the real one she saved for people who actually understood her. James smiled back, thinking about how a moment meant to destroy him had instead given him everything he'd been afraid to hope for. Three people who'd found each other against all odds were simply, beautifully, perfectly home. And somewhere in a deleted folder on Victor's phone, that original recording still existed. Not as evidence of James's cruelty, but as proof that genuine kindness always wins, even when the world sets traps designed to destroy it.